This morning for our teaching time, we are going to think through the big issue of euthanasia. Euthanasia is the process whereby a doctor helps to put a patient to death at the patient's request. This is a practice which is currently illegal in New South Wales as well as the ACT and the Northern Territory. But in recent times, this practice has been legalised in all the other states of our country, and it seems that there is a push to legalise euthanasia here in New South Wales. Indeed, the independent state member of Parliament for Sydney, Mr Alex Greenwich, has put forward a draft bill for Parliament to consider, a draft bill which will allow for euthanasia. Now, what are we to make of these developments as Christians? Well, to help us to think through this big issue, I interviewed our Archbishop, Kanishka Raffel, as well as Dr. Megan Best. And you might remember from last week that Dr. Megan Best is a director of Euthanasia, a Christian organisation that exists to help Christians to work through difficult ethical issues within a biblical framework. But she also has a clinical background in palliative medicine. Indeed, palliative care is a very, very important part of the debate about euthanasia, and Dr. Best is certainly very well equipped to help us to think through that. This interview was recorded about a week and a half ago, in fact on the same day that the Queensland Parliament legalised euthanasia, although at the time of recording the interview we were unaware of the result of that vote. I started the interview by asking Dr. Best about the draft bill to legalise euthanasia that has been put forward by Mr Alex Greenwich.
Voluntary assisted dying bill for New South Wales has not been presented to Parliament yet. There has been a draft bill put forward for discussion, which recommends that people who have 6 months to live, if they are suffering in a way that is unacceptable to them, can either be killed by a doctor, or the doctor can prescribe a poison for them to take in order to kill themselves.
Okay, let me ask a question about the actual name of this draft bill. Anything that we should make of the name? It's an interesting name, isn't it? Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill. Is this an attempt to sort of water it down a bit?
Yeah, I think that in euthanasia debates, we're seeing a lot of language changes that have been made in order to make the process seem a lot more palatable to the public and more widely accepted. So, for example, as a palliative care doctor, I would say I'm involved in assisted dying as my professional duty, but I certainly wouldn't be participating in activities such as those recommended by the bill. So it used to be euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The introduction of the word voluntary is unnecessary because it's built into the actual definition of the process, because if it's not voluntary when someone dies, it's murder. So of course it's voluntary. You don't need to label it as voluntary. And but people think euthanasia has nasty connotations, so they don't talk about that very much anymore. Suicide is something that our community has been taught is a bad thing, and we try to stop people from committing suicide. So they wanted to stop using that as well. So now we have voluntary assisted dying because it sounds like a more gentle process. And there's also this idea that it's a type of a medical procedure, which also makes it more acceptable to the public. But in fact, it's one person either directly killing or indirectly helping someone to kill themselves.
Now, Archbishop, we see that Victoria, Western Australia, Tasmania, South Australia and New Zealand have already passed legislation permitting euthanasia. As we're speaking today, Queensland is on the verge of passing it as well, it seems. Euthanasia also seems to be really well supported in opinion polls. Indeed, it seems that many people like the idea of having control over what happens to them near death, particularly if they are suffering in great ways. So what good reasons are there to oppose euthanasia and bills promoting euthanasia when this seems to be something that so many people want?
Thanks, Mark. Whenever I hear these sort of polling results, I always think of that episode of the old English program, Yes, Minister, in which Sir Humphrey explains to Minister Hacker how the outcome that you want can be determined by the questions that you ask. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. I think it's true to say that you know, depending on the questions that people are asked, they'll often express an opinion in favour of this. First of all, as Christians, I think opposition to euthanasia comes first of all from the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And so we start with a proposition, the reverse of the commandment, if you like, that God is the God of life and God of the living, that he has numbered our days. And so he has both the right and the authority to determine the span of our lives, and certainly as Christian people, we trust him with that. The other thing that the scriptures teach us, of course, is that human beings have a heart that is inescapably sinful, and so as soon as we begin to talk about helping somebody kill themselves or killing them at their request, as Christian people, we must be alert to the potential for sin apart from the actual killing itself. So at the moment, all of our sort of medical practice is designed around saving life, protecting life, healing, and Dr. Best works in palliative care, and so she'll be able to talk about that, I'm sure, which today, care for the dying, medical care for the dying, is really better than it ever has been before. And so the very idea that you lose control is, you know, that those words suggest something which I think aren't necessarily under describing what actually is the case. And so I think we've got God's command, God's nature, which is to be the God of the living and to be the God who's in charge of life. The command of God that we ought not to kill, and the caution of Scripture that human beings are disposed to sin. And so the reason euthanasia legislation, I think when they passed it in Victoria, they said there were 89 safeguards. And I thought, you thought in advance of 89 ways that this could go wrong. You know, there's probably many more that you didn't think of. And I think what the historical experience of is internationally is that when this comes in, actually the safeguards tend to go down. The rules start to change because practice, what you do, influences culture. And 10 years after you've introduced euthanasia, people have very different attitudes to it. So anyway, we can talk about that some more, but I think that's where we start.
So Dr. Best, I'd love to hear your response to that question as well. I heard you recently talk about a survey that was conducted in New Zealand, and that as questions were changed, so the number supporting euthanasia seemed to go down. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as part of your answer to the question about, what good reasons are there to oppose this bill?
Where do I start? Definitely, we've done research showing that the wording of the question asked changes the response to whether people want a euthanasia law to be passed. In New Zealand, as people were given more information about palliative care, they changed their mind. And once people understood that they would have adequate pain control and that care would be provided at the end of life, the support for euthanasia fell to 21%. Last week in Queensland, a poll was published where the number of people who thought the law should be passed, the law that's actually being debated today, it was actually 41%. So we hear these big numbers, but what are the people? We're told that there's this huge number of people in support of euthanasia, but I've been on Talkback Radio. I think a lot of people are confused about what the bill actually involves. And if I've had so many patients who've said to me, if I knew what was available in terms of support at the end of life, I wouldn't have been so scared. But it's that fear of the dying process that's driving this desire for control. And one way people, we're all going to die. The death rate is still 100% for humans. The only thing you can control is the timing and the manner of the dying, and that's what I think some people are holding on to. But if you look at all the places where euthanasia is currently legal, the main reason why people request euthanasia is for psychological and spiritual problems, what we call existential problems, where people are scared of becoming a burden. They're scared of being left alone, of being isolated. And these are the reasons why people want to shorten their life. And we're hearing people in Victoria, where euthanasia legislation is operating, that this is the reason a lot of people are requesting euthanasia. And in the church, there is so much we could do to help people at the end of life so that they don't feel their life is not worth living. And I don't think you even need religious reasons to oppose euthanasia legislation. As we've just heard, there is so much abuse in other countries where it is legal that I think vulnerable people in Australia, it's just not fair to legalise this and have it hanging over them at the end of life.
Now, you're mentioning, Dr. Best, about palliative care and the help that it provides. Now, Alex Greenwich, the mover of this draft bill, is quoted as saying, "It's important to remember that voluntary assisted dying does not compete with palliative care. It is estimated that 10 to 20% of end-of-life symptoms cannot be effectively controlled, and people continue to experience prolonged and agonising deaths." What do you have to say to Mr. Greenwich's
I think Mr. Greenwich is mistaken. There's absolutely no evidence that people getting quality specialist palliative care need to suffer at the end of life. Perhaps he's confusing the high quality palliative care we have in our specialist palliative care centres with what happens in other countries, or with some doctors who aren't trained in palliative care. But if you are in a specialist palliative care service, that we don't have 20% of people suffering. It's just not true. And I think it's this promotion of terrible stories at the end of life that are pushing this whole thing. But in fact, most deaths in palliative care are extremely peaceful. And people just go to sleep and they don't wake up.
A question to follow up on that. Do we have adequately resourced palliative care units in our state? So if someone is in that situation where they're near the end of life, that they need that kind of care, is that kind of care easily accessible?
No, and maybe that's where these stories of 20% of people suffering at the end of life have come from. But if you move outside the major centres in New South Wales, palliative care services are very difficult to access. We also know there's less penetration of palliative care into private hospitals, into aged care, into paediatric care. People who don't have English as their first language are less likely to access it. There are lots of groups in our community who find it difficult to access palliative care. And so one would think that that is where the government should put the money, rather than investing into a huge enterprise to make voluntary assisted dying available.
Now, as people have heard about this draft bill, and no doubt it will come before the Parliament at some point, Archbishop, let's start with you. for those of us who are in churches, what can we be doing at this time as the time draws nearer for this bill to come before the Parliament? And I suppose, given, you know, some people might be feeling a sense of inevitability about it all, given what's happened in other jurisdictions, what should we be doing at this time?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Look, I think there is a range of opinion in the Parliament. So I think it is important for people to contact their MPs and to let their members of Parliament know what they think about this issue. And I don't think it's inevitable at all. I think there's a big campaign. There's information which is potentially mistaken or what have you, as we've just heard. So I think it is important for people to know what their constituents think about it. So by all means, write to your members of Parliament and pray for the Parliament as they make this decision. It's important to be prayerful. And I think we want to be prayerful. We don't want to be anxious or angry or fearful. So we want to trust the Lord and be prayerful. And I think we want to be well informed. And in fact, Dr. Best and others, there are a number of articles on the Gospel Coalition Australia website. The Gospel Coalition Australia, if you go there and search euthanasia, you'll find a bunch of articles, including some by Megan. And I think it's good to be informed about it, because there's quite a lot of biased information or information that is skewed in one way. And I think to have good Christian thinking about it, but actually just to get factual information about this matter, as Dr. Best was saying. You don't need to be a Christian to be opposed to it. And I think the national AMA, the Australian Medical Association, have a statement on their website which opposes it. I believe that's right, of the New South Wales branch, the national branch. We've had in Australia, we've had royal commissions into aged care. We've had royal commissions into disability care. We know that despite our best intentions, we're not very good at doing this. And I think that going down this route is actually going to be, it's contrary to the common good. It's a bad law. And so Christians should not be frightened to contribute to the public debate. And as I said, you can say your own Christian convictions, but there are other reasons as well that can be made. And I think to be informed, to be prayerful, and to communicate your opinion to your representatives in Parliament.
I think that even if you like the idea of choice at the end of life, this bill is not a safe way for that to be achieved. I think that there are many ways that we can have control at the end of life without resorting to killing people who are sick and suffering. So I think that we need to let our politicians know that there are people in the community who are very concerned about this bill, as the Archbishop has said. Because of these polls, some politicians have said to me, the people in my electorate want something, and most of them want something. Look, 80% in favour. They need to hear there are some people who have concerns, and the way you can do that is just to write a letter, send an email. If you're confident, you can make a phone call and talk to them in person. You don't have to be an expert. You just need to voice your own views. And Christians, members of the public, like everyone else, and our politicians are there to represent our views. I think prayer that our politicians make wise choices and that truth prevails. But I think that also we need to realise that regardless of what's legal in our state, there can be things that are legal and not ethical for Christians, and that if this bill should pass, that we don't need to be involved with a process that says there are some lives that are not worth living. And we need to hold on to the fact that each one of us is made in the image of God. We are each of us precious, and how wonderful it will be if Christians are known as the ones who don't kill their elderly, the members of their congregation, that we are the ones who stay with those who are suffering and walk alongside them without abandoning them. And I think that would be a wonderful thing. But I think in the interests of the vulnerable in our society, we certainly need to pray that this bill does not pass.
Well, I'm very, very thankful for the input that our Archbishop and Dr. Megan Best have provided for us on this big issue of euthanasia. And as we heard in their answer to my final question, they are urging us to take action as this matter eventually comes before the Parliament. They encouraged us to do two things. The first, to get in touch with our local member in order to express concern about this matter, if indeed we are concerned about it. It just so happens that in our local area here that our church parish covers, there are two members of State Parliament. The first is Stephen Barley. He is the member for Blacktown, and the border is actually right here on Freeman Street. So Stephen represents the section of our parish, which is really the western part of it, from Freeman Street across, and it wraps around Seven Hills a bit. I've spoken with Stephen about this issue of euthanasia, and he was certainly very receptive to my views. And so I urge you, get in touch with him by emailing him at blacktown@parliament.nsw.gov.au. So that's blacktown@parliament.nsw.gov.au. The other local member around this part of the world is Mark Taylor, and he is the member for Seven Hills, so the eastern part of our parish area. Mark, in my experience, is also very open to receiving feedback from the community about important matters. So feel free to email him at sevenhills@parliament.nsw.gov.au. That is sevenhills@parliament.nsw.gov.au. So I urge you to email them shortly. Don't leave it for too long. The other thing that our Archbishop and Dr. Best urged us to do is to pray about these matters, and indeed we are going to pray about them now.